This is episode 3 of Zero Entry, an interview with Gavin Yeates. I think I'll start with throwing over to you, Gavin, and could you, for those who don't know you, could you give your backstory, please?
Sure. Well, the backstory starts the fact that I'm a geologist, graduated in geology from Adelaide Uni, and started life as a mine geologist in iron ore. And through a bizarre set of circumstances, found myself only 5 years out actually managing a mine, which sort of set up to some extent my career, both in sort of learning the full value chain of operations, but also a lot of the impact of people and culture and those sorts of things on getting things done in the mine. And then spent some time as a internal consultant, if you like, which was effectively a technical services role that meant I was able to move around to different operations. And then for the last sort of 20 years or so of my career, I got moved into corporate roles, initially working on assessment of major projects and reviewing those before they went to the board, and then leading a internal technical services team that gradually had things bolted onto it. So it started as looking after the corporate standards around geology, mining engineering.
Just to be clear to everybody, this is BHP we're talking about now. Yeah.
So for BHP globally, I was responsible for the sort of standards and processes that geology, mining engineering and metallurgy were using. And then they restructured R&D, and I picked up the technology and R&D piece. And then later on, I picked up mine operations and maintenance. So effectively in corporate Melbourne, in my group, we had everyone who actually knew anything about mining, and the corporate we were the practical guys relative to the corporate guys. And we got thrown into all sorts of M&A discussions and due diligences. And part of that, and this is probably relevant to this interview, is, and it started about 2010, 2009, I motivated that we were falling behind in the application of technology to the core mining processes. We're doing a lot in the back office, but not so much in the core mining processes. So I'm motivated to get a project going, or program of projects going, called Next Generation Mining, which had under it automated trucks, automated drills, remote operating centres, a complete refresh of the software suite and data that our mine operated using. That included fleet management and mine planning and all of those.
Just a minute there, Gavin. So that was about 2010, correct? That's. Yeah. I seem to remember sort of prior to that, it was kind of the era of the ERP systems. That was that was a real big push. And I don't think it was just BHP alone. There was a general, I think the mining industry kind of moves in waves, and that was all part of a more general switch to thinking about operational technologies. Did you observe that amongst your peers as well? So was it just within BHP, or I'm sure you were talking to other people in the other mining companies?
The BHP had taken the ERP side probably further and done more transformation around it than other companies had sort of just bolted on a new finance and HR system. But BHP's transformation around that was quite significant, and Marius Kloppers led that from the top. But there was a realisation at the end, or coming to the end of that, that actually, apart from counting the dollars and doing the people stuff and maybe procuring stuff, it didn't actually change the mine operations. In fact, operations data into the ERP system was sort of monthly resolution. It wasn't down to within shift, it wasn't activity based. So the guys running the operations still didn't have state-of-the-art tools to manage their operations in real time, and that was the focus of the next generation mining program, and that continued through and delivered things like the remote operating centre, the first autonomous trucks in BHP, the first autonomous drills in BHP, and a standardisation on a whole suite of software platforms, and not just the platforms but the configurations of those. And then, and actually it went a lot further than that, because we had to actually standardise on language, standardise on definitions. Everyone gets hung up on, how do you measure things? So just things for a truck, a cycle time, utilisation. How do you measure it? What do you include? What do you exclude? Is queue time part of utilisation or not? These sorts of debates, but really important to actually get a single set of measurements across the organisation so we could then improve. And that sort of continued to a point where we had a change in CEO, and the new CEO came in and basically said, this program's really good, but he felt it was somewhat of a catch-up exercise rather than fundamental ground-up thinking. And he basically gave me 2 years. I stepped away from the role I was in. I had about 80 people reporting to me. I went to no people reporting to me. He gave me a blank check, effectively, no budget responsibility, which was fantastic, and said, go and develop a ground-up technology strategy for the organisation. It had to be global, and it has to go to the board, because this has got to outlive, his words were, got to outlive me as a CEO. Pretty wise words, I felt. And so and he said, go and travel the world and look at other industries, but don't look at mining, because you won't learn anything there. And I thought that was pretty wise as well. And so I spent 6 months traveling the world and looking at in depth at other industries and how they were applying technology, and came back and developed a technology strategy that then resulted in sort of some pretty fundamental thinking and change in the organisation and how it approaches technology. And it's fairly relevant to your last podcast around, software eats the world, because there was some recognition that that unless we developed capability in that space, we were going to be potentially open to threat, and there was huge opportunity with that going forward. So that was that led me through till about 2015, 16. And once I'd finished that strategy, nothing left seemed exciting. So I took the opportunity to take a retirement, in inverted commas, and set up myself as a...
Yeah, you've had a very busy retirement, I've noticed.
Yeah.
So,
emphasis on inverted commas.
The main point of this interview was actually to flush out, because I'm really interested, this channel's really interested in the human element, not the individual pieces of technology and how they might be applied in mining, but how humans adapt and adopt the technology. And one of the things that really excited me in previous conversations was that you had a particularly interesting story in your role in that innovation role in BHP of a project that succeeded marvelously, and then almost an equivalent project that didn't go so well. So I wonder if you could just start by describing those projects, and then, maybe we can dig in a bit as to what were the human elements that were driving those success and failures.
Yeah, I guess my it's actually a program of projects, sort of major change, and it was around what we termed the next generation mining, which included things like remote operations and automation and software and data primarily. But the high level narrative of this is that was picked up, and my role and the role of my group in the corporate function was to do the early TRL, the early technology readiness level pieces of work, and get it to a stage to hand over to the operating businesses. And we used we simplified the TRL along the lines the oil and gas industry does, to a 7-scale TRL, which is basically concept, bench scale, some sort of proof of concept, a trial, and then taking it into the field, supported and then unsupported sort of rollout. My job was to get it so that the operations could run a supported trial in the field, and it would add value prove that it would add value to their business. So we followed that, and that's one of the things I guess I learnt through the interaction with other companies outside of mining, is the need for a systematic technology development process to take you through those stages, so everyone's aware of what stage you're at and what to expect from, whether it be a pilot or a trial or an implementation. And then so we implemented that, and to the credit of the iron ore leadership team at the time, who really came on board and showed amazing leadership, put in the remote operating centre. Now that didn't actually have a lot of technology in it. It was a fantastic centre, but it was primarily a people project. It was changing the way we operated, moving thousands of people from the Pilbara to Perth, fundamentally changing structures and how people worked, where they lived, and the management team took hold of that and really ran with it, to the point that showed economic benefit in months, payback in months, not years, and was an amazing success. The things like the automated equipment, I think that the drills were fantastic, partly because they could be isolated. They had less interactions. Trucks was more difficult. And this is a really good lesson too. Vendors will put their hand up and say, yeah, I've got a truck that drives by itself. And yes, it can drive by itself, but its job in the mine is not to drive by itself. It's to actually integrate and choreograph its movements with everything else in the mine, some of them automated, some of them manned. Yeah. And the degree of difficulty of moving from a truck that drives by itself to a productive unit in the field was the best part of a decade of significant investment by the mining company, not the OEM, to get it to that stage. So, I think there's a lot of learnings around sort of understanding what makes these things work in practice. But so the successful project was delivering all that and actually fundamentally transforming the iron ore business. And I guess the exemplar in that is, and you can go to the public records and see what the operating costs of mines were in iron ore in 2010-11, and it was up in the $30 range, $33 sort of per tonne on a ship.
If I remember correctly, some of them were even a little bit above the 40s. I think the
marginal producers were,
yeah.
But the Rio Tintos, FMGs and BHPs were fighting it out in the mid-30s.
Yep.
And probably BHPs was a little higher than Rios and FMGs.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at where they are and have been for the last couple of years, they're down below 15, $14 a tonne. Now, they're still moving the same tonnes. They're still using the same infrastructure. What's changed? And what's changed is their mode of operation, underpinned by technology and a degree of automation and a lot of data and a lot of software and all of that being, I guess, utilised by people who actually switched on to we're going to operate differently in this world, and not being scared of things like standardisation and then measurement and improvement and those sorts of things, and transparency, having the data making what they were doing transparent.
Now that what you've just described there, in my personal experience, is rare, right? It's and most peers I talk to in industry, while occasionally we do see instances like what you've just described, where there's this sort of massive collective behaviour to change, and then the results, like what you've just described, are very dramatic when it does happen. What were the circumstances that, because you can't just have a few heroes. You might have some leaders, that's fine, but people have to be willing to follow the leaders. So what were the circumstances that sort of drove that collective behaviour, do you think, Gavin? Is it something? Was it something in the water, or was there something else going on?
Look, it started from the top. I reported to a guy called Marcus Randolph, who was very visionary, but also empowering. And the president of Iron Ore also reported to the same guy. He was able to allow us to collectively create a vision for what the business could look like. And the credit then goes to the Iron Ore guys, their senior leadership under Jimmy Wilson and Tony Ottaviano, who really captured this and ran with it. Those guys really deserve the credit because they did the heavy lifting within the Iron Ore organisation. But, I think people want to follow good leaders, and in those cases, I think the other thing that happened, particularly with the remote operating centre, is it happened quickly, very quickly. And when you're doing major change that involves a lot of people and their remuneration and their living circumstances and all of that, you have to be really clear with people, both the reason for the change, what it's going to affect them, paint a picture of the future for them, but not give them too much time to agonise and worry about it. Just get on and do it, and let them experience and deal with their issues along the way. And the Iron Ore management team did a fantastic job in actually making that happen. Does that that was literally just a big people project. Yes, technology was underpinning it all, etc., and there were issues and along the way, but fundamentally, it was people could benefits very quickly of why we were doing what we were doing. And I think the other thing is often, I think in that stage, we got the balance right between the corporate direction and early stage de-risking, and then hand over to operations and let the operations go for it. With corporate just supporting and cheering it from the sidelines almost. But getting that balance right, I see this pendulum swinging constantly from totally decentralized implementations to highly centralized. And I think the answer is in that balance of having the corporate function doing the higher risk early stage, and then an intelligent handover, and having the operations guys. And I think that's well articulated in that that book. I know you've read Loonshots. Talks very clearly about that balance, and I think in that case we got that right. There's plenty of other cases where we didn't.
Was there any like external factors driving the change?
Oh yeah, probably at the right time, the price tanked.
Okay.
So it was, we were right into implementation, and 2013, I think it was.
Well, wasn't that after a big capital investment at the time?
Oh yeah, yeah. So through the early 2000s, or from 2002-3 right through to 2010, a massive amount of capital was spent on the iron ore business. Mm-hmm. Virtually everything was recapitalised. So new mines were created, new processing facilities at the mine sites instead of at the port, new port facilities, everything was recapitalised. And that was on the back of $160 iron ore price and margins. So you're sitting there with a $35 cost and $160 price. The margin's not bad.
I want me one of those businesses. Yeah.
But 2013, China hit some difficulty. Demand dropped, price tanked, and for a short period, it went to $30. Mm-hmm. So you're sitting there with a $35 operating cost. You've got a iron ore price of $30, and you've got a massive, and I'm talking tens of billions of dollars of capital on your books that needs to be paid back. You've got a problem.
Yeah, so it's kind of like BHP put billions of dollars on red, and all the colours on the wheel turned black.
Correct. So, and the important thing is timing. Timing is everything in these things.
Timing.
You're already into a transformation project at that time that has some potential paybacks. One option was shelve it or just go back to what you used to do, or keep it going and deliver But
in that particular circumstance, going back to what you used to do wasn't even an option, because you're underwater, weren't you, on basically on a cash basis at that moment in time, and who knows, and it's a commodity market, who knows when the commodity price comes back. So
the old school thinking was, because the iron ore price got so high, we just got lazy and we weren't operating very effectively, so that our costs blew out. We can do what we use. We can do it the old way better, and bring those costs down. That's the old pragmatic argument.
And but let's be real too, Gavin. That may not have been a bad argument, but it might have, at best brought your cost maybe $1 or so below, because that is the normal practice of mining companies. We'll go back to the tried and true. Our mission is to get our cash costs just below the commodity price, and we'll just hang in there until times become better.
Yep, and we could show that in the past, and just take things like operating a fleet of trucks, just by the metrics of things like utilisation and cycle times and those sorts of measures, we could show that where we were at that point was significantly worse than we'd been, let's say, in the late 90s, when we'd had a decade of pretty poor commodity price, and we had to operate really well to actually make any money through the 90s. So we could show that, yes, you could do better. But the discussion amongst the leadership at that time was more about how do we lock it in and make it structural, rather than to operate like we used to operate in the 90s, a truck fleet. We needed to have a whole lot of good operating practices, good people management, all lining up. And we'd shown that it was difficult to maintain that over time. So, you had to have impeccable people management, you had to have hot seat changes, you had to do all of the things to try and get those trucks utilised as close to 100% of the time as possible. You had to be constantly on top of the process of how many trucks per shovel have you got in the fleet? Are you operating in a truck limited or a shovel limited world? Constantly on top of all of that, and across a growing operation. You've got to remember too, iron ore back in the 90s was producing under 100 million tonnes. By 2013, when the price tanked, they were close to 300 million tonnes, or 250 million tonnes or so. So massive scale up. And this sort of goes to somewhat to your Software Eats the World question around how do we lock that in and replicate it with low marginal cost.
Yeah.
And, it really came down to how do we measure, standardise, replicate, down to the smallest entity.
So when you're having that discussion, because there's almost like a two-world scenario. We do it the traditional way. There's some risks associated with that. We're going to pioneer this new way of doing business, which happens, as you pointed out, sort of follows the Software Eats the World sort of nominal idea. But how was the perception of risk about those? Those conversations must have been pretty intense, I would imagine. And how was those risks traded off, and how did we end up on the what I would call the good side of the equation versus grinding it out because some would perceive that option as being less risky. How did we tilt it to the side of the angels, shall we say, when that was a kind of pioneering exercise?
Yeah, so probably in iron ore there was a number of things working for it in that. One is the leadership was outstanding and could see that the growth had meant that there was a lot of newish, lesser experienced middle management out at the mine sites who were open to doing things differently. And they brought in some people from outside. And I remember, it happened at about the time Victoria was closing its Toyota factory, and they
I remember that time. Yeah,
grabbed a couple of the operations managers out of the Toyota factory to bring the Toyota system in, and it was all around how do we systematise, and it was sort of accelerated by the remote operating centre, because when iron ore was operating, it was operating, I don't know, more than half a dozen different mine sites, right? And each of those had their own management structure. And so whether it was mine planning or it was short-term mine planning, or whether it was operating the crushing and screening plant, those people worked for that particular mine in that mine site and developed an operating methodology that worked for them. When we moved to the remote operating centre, what was, I think, pivotal and part of the design of the system that the guys came up with was that they moved people who were doing the same role but at a different mine site to sit together in pods. And so all of the short-term mine planners sat together. All of the crushing and screening plant operators sat together. All of the truck dispatchers sat together. And initially, there was no effort to standardise the systems. But immediately, when you've got two people doing almost the same role, sitting right next to each other, but their screens are different and their systems are delivering different results, they immediately go, well, why is your system doing that? And when, a really simple one I remember early was, and these were brand new operating facilities just being built by the same engineering contractor to the same standards, but the process control systems were fundamentally operating differently. And so in one instance, a bin would get to a high limit and it would stop in a, how would I call it, a controlled way, as in it stopped the downstream first and then ran all the belts clean, and so it meant that startup was reasonable. In the mine right next door, the operator would crash stop.
Yeah, okay.
And it was a several hour exercise to get the plant back up and running. And that was just for a bin full scenario. And the answer, and this goes back to the software eats the world problem, the answer was a simple cut and paste of a little bit of code from one process control system to the other, and they're now operating standardly. And that the payback on that, on lost throughput, was massive.
And the transfer of that knowledge was zero marginal cost. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
So those things that you, as soon as you started to see the benefit of that, it started to snowball. And those guys were using the term, the buzzword now is agile methodology, but they were using that sort of methodology for their daily operations. They'd have a daily operations meeting with a whiteboard with all their measurements, and it forced a standardisation of language and measurements and operating approach, etc., etc. So that, on the good side, there was a lot to learn, and a lot to learn around how to manage remotely, how to, where's the accountability, what's the accountability of the mine manager versus the manager of the facility of the remote operating centre. All of those sorts of things were still had to be sorted, but once you start to get on a positive cycle and people are on board with the way they're operating, and the transparency of being able to see everything both at a local level and then at a macro level on the big screen was really important.
All right. So that's the happy story. So now let's wander over to the dark side a bit. So I know you have a project where you can contrast this, almost the same, but it didn't go so well. So maybe you could just throw in the narrative on that, and then I'll by questioning I'll try and dig into what's different, right?
The interesting thing was the intent of this whole program was to get it operating in iron ore and then move it to coal. And in fact, use some of the same people. So the team that built and implemented the remote operating centre was supposed to do that in iron ore. Everything was supposed to happen as a sort of roll-on, and it was just going to cascade. And I guess the standing back, many years intervening, it's easy to be wise in hindsight, but probably we didn't do the preparatory work at the ground level with the management of coal. We had a coal representative on our steering committee, and they were across.
Before we go on, when you say preparatory work, what exactly do you mean? So what did you do at iron ore that you didn't do in the coal division specifically?
I think involve the senior leadership team of the business in preparation way before planning, just the conceptual and the understanding of what was about to take place. We just assumed that they'd seen the great results at iron ore, that they'd be hungry for taking it on in their business, and it would have translated by osmosis to some extent. That was clearly a grossly wrong assumption. I think we also assumed a similar management structure and culture, and that wasn't the case. Vastly different operating environment.
Well, okay, the culture bit. What specifically about the culture would you say was different between the two divisions?
I think there was a vastly different demographic. So age profile, length of service, hierarchy.
So I'm assuming coal was older. You talked about the infusion in iron ore of lots of people from outside of industry. So I presume that didn't happen in coal. If my recollection was right, that's, we weren't seeing the big expansion in coal at that time that was pulling in people out of other industries. Is that the specifics of
pretty much
right?
Iron ore had grown almost threefold, whereas coal output had grown marginally.
Yeah.
They had grown in material movement because their strip ratios were going up.
Yeah.
But they were handling that with contractors a lot. So, that whole modus operandi was different. I think the issue around management, the coal industry is quite different in that it has mandated positions that are regulatory positions, and so the way of working is quite different. But at a higher level, I put it back to we at corporate assumed that they would just get on board. Instead of, we didn't do the active engagement and ground up work. And there's also a human issue of taking something from one business and rolling it into the next is somewhat, how would I call it, arrogant, rather than allowing that business to implement it themselves and own it. So there was a degree of, well, we're different. What worked in iron ore is not going to work for us. You know, all of those excuses came out of the woodwork, which are all human traits.
Yes.
But were, I think, exacerbated by the fact that we hadn't done the groundwork and we hadn't prepared the people, but also the difference in demographic and structure and incentives and all.
What about external factors? Because you did paint a picture of a fairly big external factor. You know, iron ore had gone cash negative after a major investment and scale up.
Yeah.
What were at the same time? Again, it's the opposite. There wasn't. If I recollect, there wasn't that big scale up. The margins were still reasonably good.
Well, in fact, right at the time where we were sort of looking to do this, the metallurgical coal price peaked.
Mm-hmm.
Really.
Yes. Yeah. Now I remember.
And, you know, and when you sort of go back to, you know, and I put a lot of things back to incentives. The incentive was, don't put any of the production at risk because we're getting good margin. So why would we introduce a potential risk into the business? So from that perspective, management was operating rationally, but you know, very different outcome. Now, having said that, roll forward 5 to 7 years, and coal have made the moves. They own them now. You know, well after I left the organisation, they have put in a remote operating centre. They are moving down the automation route, but they are doing it their way and in their, I guess they're owning it.
But have they had the same, like back at iron ore, you were talking about, you know, massive unit cost impacts within months, right? Yep. The long drawn out process of innovation is one, like, for those of us who've been in the industry a long time, I just recognize, right? So with coal in this instance, while they've made, you know, you can refer to other parts of the mining industry and start copying it, but it seems to me what you're describing is, you know, an adoption pattern that I would call more standard, which is not your step change, which you know, we've had a little bit of discussion about. You know, you wrote those articles on zero entry, which I shared in an addendum video. But the more sort of pedestrian, incremental improvement that, you know, well, we're actually quite good at in mining, I think, but that's generally the pattern. Do you see that's what's happened in coal?
Yeah, to an extent, because their primary economic driver is all of their mines are getting deeper, their strip ratios are going up, and it's sort of like a slow squeeze. It's gradually getting squeezed. So they have to keep their innovation at least up with the rate of increase of their strip ratios and things like that. So to me, that you know, that will be, I guess the step change for them will be when they can get particularly top coal caving working and can go all underground. And the reason why top coal caving has to work is because in those particular mines, you're talking greater than 10 metre seam heights. And if you use traditional longwall mining techniques, you only take 4.5, 5 metres of the seam. So you waste half the resource. Whereas top coal caving has the potential to take the full seam, and we need to in some cases deal with multi-seam mining as well, which is a degree of difficulty. So there is potential step change out there, but whilst we're in the open cut world, it's just a gradual squeeze of the economic levers. But I also put it down to the management drivers and incentives and the passion of the and it comes back to when you're making good margin, management's focus is keep it going and don't risk it, versus when you're underwater, when you're underwater already, what can we do? I'm more open to a transformational change at that point than if I was making good margin. So timing is everything, but I also think both the leadership was different, but I also put it back to our engagement with those leadership people was different as well. So
okay. What were so could you also contrast a little bit the difference? Not let's say you focus a lot on leadership, but at least in my observation, what sort of happens at that sort of frontline leadership level also matters deeply. What were the sort of, could you contrast the different behaviours that you saw from the frontline leaders in iron ore versus coal, which also might have been, demographic related, but draw your own conclusions. But what did you observe, and why do you think that what might have been a difference in that sort of frontline leadership roles?
Yeah, when I went to talk to mine managers in coal, I was generally talking to someone who was older and had been in the industry longer, but had got to that role through being excellent at, and in fact enjoyed, firefighting. Constantly dealing with issues, and the concept of having something highly systematized and operating smoothly would have been boring to them. So they had been rewarded through their career for dealing with chaos. And everything we were trying to do in the iron ore example was to take the chaos out and systematize everything, standardize everything, run it as smoothly and as automated as possible. That was a sort of almost antithesis or an opposite to what these guys were used to operating in, but actually enjoyed operating in. And it was sort of like you were taking away their enjoyment.
So the iron ore guys in the same position, they behaved differently because what? They were younger, they came from different industries. What was it? That what was the, and what was in the water that made the difference?
In the process, a whole lot of new people were recruited into the iron ore business. And many of those came from other industries. And I think the ability to do it quickly and get them to see operating difference and the benefit of standardization was extreme. But just to sort of, I guess, an example that would demonstrate that difference is when they were recruiting, I think it was for short-term schedulers in iron ore, they recruited a number of people from outside the industry. One of them was an air traffic controller who wanted a less stressful life.
Yeah.
And one of them was a Met train controller who'd been operating the passenger trains around Perth.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the air traffic controller, from what I'd observed, brought to that team of short-term schedulers a degree of schedule discipline that mining hadn't seen. So they were open to the, there's two things here. By going to the remote operating centre, you were able to specialise roles. So you had a hyper-specialised role called a short-term scheduler, whose job was just to schedule things.
Mm.
Now, in the old world, and probably exemplified in years and years at coal, that was the role of the graduate mining engineer on his rotation. In his first 5 years, would spend time doing drill and blast, then time in short-term scheduling, then time in something else.
Yeah, it was a training role. Been there, done that.
So, and that was institutionalised in the rotation of the graduates. So turning hyper-specialised roles, and hyper-specialisation has its negatives as well as its positives, but it meant that you could get a professional scheduler. And, the outcome of a professional scheduler was completely different to a graduate mining engineer on his rotation. So it was a completely different approach. It's highly professionalised, hyper-specialised roles, as opposed to rewarding someone for getting a bit of experience here, a bit of experience there, and they're observing their leader getting rewarded for firefighting in the chaos. And, that's a completely different culture.
Yeah.
And I would observe, and I've done, since I've left BHP, I've done a lot of work with small and medium-sized mining companies. And when I go into those, most of them are in the world where the mine manager is king of his fiefdom, and he got there because he's really good at sorting out when things go wrong.
Yep.
And they are stuck in that world of the more chaos, the better it is, almost. Because we're really good at fixing stuff and getting things going again.
Okay. Actually, as you were describing these two scenarios, it sort of came to me, it just sort of sprung into my head as you were sort of talking about this, it is different from your iron ore example is different from the software it's a world example, in that I think the causality went the other way. So in Mark Andreessen's work, they talk about, basically in software, you're taking a complex series of tasks, you're abstracting them, standardizing, as you would call it, and then replicate, then you can replicate at zero marginal cost, right? It seemed to me what happened in your iron ore business was it went the other way. You scale the business first. So normally you produce, in other industries, you produce the software and then you scale. But it seems to me what happened, you scale the business and it just was unwieldy using traditional techniques, and you had to kind of backfill with the technologies.
That's right.
Yeah.
But I think the critical thing was we scaled the business, then we went to a different operating mode, being the remote operating centre, which made the unwieldiness very transparent.
Yes.
And people are sitting next to each other getting vastly different outcomes from the same operation, are then saying, oh.
But what you were doing was creating the place where information, technique, knowledge, programming could move at zero marginal cost.
Correct.
And when you tried to lift and shift that to coal, well, actually that wasn't zero marginal cost. You've just enunciated a whole series of cost structures that was the impediment. So things work when, and that was the case of my last video, was it isn't the software itself per se, it's the use of software to get certain tasks transferred and scaled at zero marginal cost. Without that, and once you don't have that, it really doesn't work anymore. But that scaling and then bringing in and infusing, the scale caused the infusion and change of demographics, which then created the grounds in which you could create those environments where things could transfer at zero marginal cost.
So
yeah,
that's true. But I'll throw another issue in there, and it relates to this, I guess, the cycle of transformation in businesses.
Yeah.
And it's something I've talked about previously.
I've heard your discussions on this. So yeah, no, please bring us into that, because I think it's very enlightening.
The idea of cadence that mining works at. If I go back to iron ore, the iron ore business had just grown massively. It had all new capital. So all the plants were brand new, and they had a degree of standardisation. At the small scale, in the PLCs and the process control and SCADA systems, there was differences, but the fundamental infrastructure was pretty standardised. Even the same OEMs, the same trucks, same model of truck, the same drills were used. So, when we did the drill automation, they were all Atlas Copco Pit Vipers, and they were all relatively new. So they were all fly-by-wire, so they could all be retrofitted with automation. So that the degree of standardisation that was already there through recent capital development was one of the fundamental underpinnings of that success. If I go to coal, they hadn't had that. Every mine was developed in a different decade, almost. It was sort of very organic growth. They all had different process plants, the degree of standardisation of their systems. They had different radios on their trucks. They had different trucks, different OEMs, different drills. It was vastly different to iron ore. So the starting point for standardisation and I think we as a technology group trying to commence that, coming off the back of iron ore, we didn't understand that, and they had to go through a level of basic standardisation before they could get to the launch pad that iron ore had. Now, this sort of relates to the cadence question that I've been observing in the industry is the first point is mining is different from other service and product organisations because it's dealing with an ore body in the ground. And ore bodies are rare. They're,
and unique. Yeah.
They're fat tail distributions to the extreme. So the one thing a mining company can't change is the ore body, and they can't create one if they haven't got one. So everything should revolve around the ore body in the ground. The second thing is you get one chance usually, and iron ore was a bit different because it got a second chance to recapitalise. But most mines have one chance to capitalise and set up that operation. And I think back to my days at Cannington when we designed that, and we agonised over some of the key design criteria that the operations guys are probably pulling their hair out now saying, why on earth did you do that? Like, why did we put the shaft down the middle of the ore body and sterilise half the ore body? because it made economic sense from a centre of gravity and haulage optimization point of view. But it's now sterilised the highest grade part of the ore body that they will at some stage have to take that shaft pillar out. But, you know, it's those sort of decisions that you make once up front, and you set the scale and the operating mode that make all the difference. And very rarely does a mine get an opportunity to recapitalise completely. So from a cadence point of view, you're operating at the cadence of an ore body development. You lock in your operating methodology at the time, and then you're tinkering around the edges. You're putting little incremental innovations on, but you're not really fundamentally changing it. And when I look at, you know, it's made worse by, particularly in the small to medium-sized mining companies who might have a reasonable ore body, but they've only evaluated the next 5 years, say. And you talk to many of the gold miners in WA, they've got 5 years reserves left, so they don't spend anything on fundamentally changing their operating methodology. But if you go back in history, they've had 5 years reserves for the last 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
And they're only evaluating the next 5 years all the time, but they've been doing that for 30 years. And at no point do they step back and say, actually, we have another 30 years in front of us. How do we want to set ourselves up to operate for that next 30 years? They're very much in this incremental, well, what are we doing for the next 5 years? Well, you know, even strategic questions like electrification. Well, we haven't got the mine life to justify that, so we won't do it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I see a lot of, I guess, barriers to technology and innovation in mining, driven by that short-termism and the cadence of, well, we've spent our capital, we're not going to recapitalise, so we'll just tinker around the edges now.
Yeah, I'd agree. That's the observation. It's one I've, as a vendor to miners, have been frustrated with for most of my career. I must say I'm no longer frustrated by it. I think I decided to go and try and understand it instead of rile against it. In fact, my next episode of this channel it's actually about the incentives to fail at innovation, and I believe there are some fundamental incentives to not succeed. And I think I can even mathematically write that out. But anyway, I'll leave that for another time. And I think a lot of the discussion we've had here actually helps. You know, I'll probably link back to a lot of the discussion here when I unravel that little interesting human dynamic. But the circumstances around which innovation does happen fairly rapidly is generally around, you know, where there's an external shock, like you saw in iron ore. So I'd
actually a little. You need that, but it's a bit like you know, major accidents. You see all of the holes in the Swiss cheese line up, and things happen.
Yes,
pretty much the same. You need a number of things to line up.
Correct.
To make it happen, and if they're not all lining up, it's a struggle.
And I think that's where probably in the last 10 years, I've been thinking lots about incentives. I think it was Charlie Munger, who's Warren Buffett's partner, said, describe to me the incentives and I can forecast the outcomes. And when you see something very consistent happen, you have to say, well, you have to ask, what are the incentives that drives that behavior? Because today I start with, even if I see what I think is irrational behavior, I start with the premise that no, underneath that is there's some rational people following incentives, and I'm just not seeing the incentives. And if I can somehow, you know, part the veil and see through the fog of war and actually see what the incentives are driving the people, well, maybe then you've got a chance to do something about it. And in fact, this is very much what this channel is about, is trying to explore, learn, it'll help me learn stuff, and hopefully we'll share that as well. But it's at the core, there's incentives that drive all of these things, and I just struggle all the time to understand what they are. But that's what I'm reaching for here. Yeah.
It's sort of interesting because a favourite topic of mine is the whole incentives, because I started the first decade of my career where there weren't specific incentives. We got paid a salary to do a job, and I talked to high-powered management consultants now, and they're aghast. How did you know what to do? And we said we just did the right thing,
Yeah. But I think people get confused when I talk about incentives. It's not KPIs or that sort of stuff. I know you and I have had discussions about KPI. I don't want to dive into that too much, but I think we both have a general negative view. But when I think I'm using the economist definition of incentives. So even if all you have is a salary and there are no bonus, you still have incentives. You have an incentive to not lose your salary, right? That's an incentive, right? You have an incentive to be praised. You have an incentive to be promoted. You have an incentive to create a legacy, to be able to point to your kids and say, I did that. These are all incentives. Yeah. And so I don't go for the KPI and,
Well, I think the KPIs actually distort what should be more natural incentives. So, but that's a rabbit warren that...
not for today.
Not for today. But it is, when you go to a mine site and you start to talk to them about implementing technology or doing some form of transformation, if you don't understand incentives, you're going to be on the back foot. That's correct. One of the first questions I ask when I go into a mine site, is to try and tease out what are the incentives, both the explicit and the implied incentives, because unless you understand those, you're going to be fighting uphill.
And I suspect, well, it's my thesis that it's the implied incentives that are the more powerful ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if I go back to the coal example,
yes,
the mine management have been rewarded in the past and self-selected in the past through firefighting chaos
to enjoy it.
And that's their incentive.
Yes. Just enjoying the job is an incentive, right? Yeah. All right. Thanks. Is there anything else you want to sort of, now that I've got you, do you want to, you've talked about the Cadence stuff. We've touched a little bit on Software Eats the World.
Probably the area I'd just go back to, the papers that Peter Knights and I we've been trying to do thought leadership in just the whole zero entry, because that's zero entry is a milestone, if you like, on the journey for mining that is now well and truly in view. And the key point there is that the benefits, both economic and safety and other benefits, are non-linear. Not only are they non-linear, they're discontinuous.
Mm-hmm.
So at certain points in time, you get a disproportionate uplift in benefit.
This is your step change, right?
Well, at the point where you say, I'm never going to put a person inside that mine or mining area, whether it be open pit or underground, you can then affect a completely different mine design, and that has a huge economic benefit, disproportionate economic benefit. And then at the point where you say, I'm going to redesign my equipment, now it's autonomous, to a completely different scale and shape and operating mode, because I can do it autonomously, I open up a whole new set of ore bodies and geographies and geometries of mining, extensions to existing ore bodies, new ore bodies that were never considered mineable because you had to put a person on it, or you were using equipment scaled for a person. That's a disproportionate benefit. So I guess the thing that we're sort of talking about is then, trying to define that economic benefit, that step change, but also what's stopping us getting there. What are the gaps in the whole automation suite? And it's not the core mining equipment. It tends to be all the ancillary services and everything else around it. Trying to plot a path to encourage people to explore that. And going back to your Software Eats the World, unless the incumbents move there, others will, I think. And I think incumbents are still slow to move to the extreme step change. They're still in incremental mode.
And I'll get to. Oh, by the way, for all the viewers, I'll put links to those articles below again, and plus the addendum episode where I mentioned them. But do you think that there's even in any standard mining operation, there's a lot of like white space? Like you even talked about Cannington, and there's a pillar of high value reserves there. Do you think there's going to be it's easier to put in some new technology sometimes where a lot of the existing infrastructure already exists? So do you think, is these opportunities, are they going to be new startups, right? Some new ore body where they're just going to do it in a radically different way from anybody else? Or are they going to be add-on businesses? So I won't even call them technologies, but maybe, I kind of think like the high wall miners for coal, right? You got to a limit of your reserve, and then you'd have these contractors who would come in and punch holes into the high wall and extract some additional coal. Is there sort of scope for those kind of businesses? Is the innovation, do you think, going to be in those sort of places, or are they going to be more your Cadence story? No, it'll only happen when someone starts there.
I think there are opportunities, but I think they're peripheral. The mining companies generally are very protective of their economic rent from the ore. So the economic rent they get from the ore body, the margins that they get, they're fairly protective of. But there are peripheral pieces where someone with a different technology that could be used, let's say, to extract tailings, different metals from tailings or whatever it might be, those are absolutely up for grabs. The other thing that we're getting our head around as an industry is where the ore body is very unique and rare. Going along with that is the social license to operate is becoming rare and valuable. And so I guess carrying on operations under an existing social license to operate, so in existing mines, finding extensions and continuing, has a disproportionate benefit to starting a new mine, because starting a new mine, you not only have to find the mine, but you then have to establish a social license to operate. And if you look around at there's plenty of mines in the world that have been found but haven't been able to establish a social license to operate for whatever, be it cultural or environmental or whatever means. And I think the value of an existing operation is significantly higher because of the established social license to operate. Mm-hmm. And I think in the past we've undervalued that in the whole scheme of things. Mm-hmm. We will work out ways to mine the extensions and etc. And I think we've got to take some longer term thinking rather than short term thinking into this. That's why we've got to assess ore bodies not on just the next 5 years and drill out just the next bit. We've got to actually start to look at, well, how big is this thing and how are we going to exploit it over the long term?
Okay. All right, Gavin. I think I really appreciate it. I'm going to wrap this up at this point. I really appreciate your sharing this story. I think it's going to, your basic story is going to amaze a lot of people who listen to this channel, which I'm very surprised at. I'm kind of regularly getting now up into the 50s, 60s. Not great for a YouTube channel, but it's a very narrow, audience that will be interested in this stuff. But I think they'll be fascinated by your story and really appreciate it. And again, you've educated me. Thank you. In the next episode, we'll be looking at the incentives to not even try or fail at innovation projects, and it will be underpinned by some of the anecdotal examples that Gavin has given in this interview. We'll see you then. Bye.